Hello everyone. This particular video is going to talk about chapter 1 of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. We're going to start by, I'm going to direct you to take a look at the epigraph that is at the beginning of chapter 1. So you may have to go back even before the title page and take a look at that. After you've had a few minutes to absorb what those 4 lines have to say, I want you to then look up who the author is. And that is the theme alert of the novel. Fitzgerald has done that on purpose to sort of lay that foundation there. So you need to make sure you're ready to make those observations for what is presented symbolically and how these characters are developed and so forth. And the most important character in the novel is arguably the narrator. This is the character who is going to share all the main plots and introduce all these characters to us. And so that's one of the reasons why it's important as we are introduced to the narrator, Nick Carraway, that we have a little bit of background information on him and what kind of a narrator he is. And so that's why Fitzgerald has established that part where Nick talks about how people just will come up to him and share their stories. He's somebody people trust, even people he doesn't know. It's sort of an intuitive situation that he finds other people are in. He's the recipient, he's the one hearing these stories, even though he hasn't asked for them. And this particular story, The Great Gatsby, is him reflecting on a time where something has happened in his life where he didn't anticipate it going the way that it did. So ultimately, the way that the story is set up in chapter 1, we're going to find that this is Nick looking back, reflecting. Therefore, pretty much the whole plot of the novel is all a flashback. And so that's just something for you to keep in mind. He is established as an observer. Fitzgerald does that so that we sort of also have an understanding of how he is always present for these events to happen. He's someone who's always, on the outside looking in. So he has that dual purpose of he can be this sort of arguably objective observer, and that's going to be something for us as readers to determine is really how much responsibility he has or does not have in terms of some of the things that take place. There's certainly a moral gray area involved in the story. But that's also one of the reasons why it's important for Fitzgerald to have Nick establish his family heritage. He's got family that was here before the United States Civil War. This is not a family of recent immigrants. They're a family that's established. So that sort of lays that class line down without explicitly saying those things. It's also important too because certainly he's somebody who, they're fairly well off, but these are Midwestern folk. Yet he went to school at Yale, and that's important because that's how he's connected to the character Tom Buchanan, who is introduced later on in chapter 1. They were 1 year apart, so they weren't chummy, buddy-buddy. But again, Nick was able to observe Tom in college. They were potentially even in the same fraternity. And so he has that sort of insight there. And yet also he is distantly related, second cousins once removed, to Tom's wife, Daisy. And so through the Buchanan side, that's how, because her name's Daisy Faye Buchanan, the Fays are people from the Midwest. And so he's able to have that connection to her. Again, it's not super connected. They're not siblings or even first cousins, but they're enough related that they certainly know who the other person is and can connect that. I want to talk about the geography here because the geography does a couple of things for Fitzgerald to be able to discuss some things about class. If you look at a map of Manhattan and where Long Island is, you can see Manhattan, of course, is an island, and then you've got Long Island, which juts off into the water. And according to the novel, you have these pieces of land that sort of come up as if they're egg shapes off of the sort of northern side of Long Island. And so what is established is you have these egg-shaped landmarks And on the east egg, you have the old money, people who are well established, people who are like what we would know today as old money as like the Hiltons. Anybody who's been born within the last 50 years was born into money. The Vanderbilts. You may even know the television anchor Anderson Cooper as a Vanderbilt. His mother is Gloria Vanderbilt. And so even though he makes his own money, he's somebody who's never not had money. Same thing with Paris Hilton. And so there's a certain ease and comfort with money. And that creates a class system of the haves and the people who go way, way back. And that's going to influence their attitudes. Then you have the folks who are on the west egg, of course, separated by that bay, even though they can get to each other from the land that's on the south if they need to. And those are new money people. This is the west egg. So these people might have just as much money, if not more money, than the folks who live on the east egg. But there is a class divide in the same way that if I suddenly won the lottery and became a millionaire multiple times over, I wouldn't necessarily fit in with people who have always had money. They're not going to become my best friends. It's not going to be necessarily easy to start running around and going to the same parties and so forth. And yet, here's Nick, somebody who's got to work for a living, even though he has all these sort of connections with Yale and his own family line. But because he's able to rent a bungalow in the West Egg for so cheap, and please do the math to do a cost comparison between how much he pays per month versus how much the other people in the West Egg are paying per month to live in their grand mansions. And there will be something on my PowerPoint slide about the various architecture. The Buchanans live in a Georgian colonial. That's referencing back to the old world, the colonies and so forth. Nick is going to live in a bungalow, which is a 1.5 story home. And then you have Gatsby, his neighbor, who lives in what is a replica of the Hotel de Ville in Normandy, which has got its own sort of symbolism as well. But that's important to sort of look at that architecture because Fitzgerald is utilizing it to make comments about class and distinguishing these individuals who are intermixing in the whole novel. I want you to also pay attention to the seasons. When the flashback begins, it's spring. It's the spring of 1922. Spring represents hope. There is newness, excitement, freshness in the air, and so forth. And as we get closer to summertime and it gets hotter and hotter and then get into the fall, all these things represent change. I do want to make a note. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote this novel between 1924 and then it was published on April 10th, 1925. He did get a teeny tiny bit confused, experts believe, on the timeline for the characters and the timeline for himself. The least you need to know, we are definitely going with the fact that the flashback occurs in 1922, and so he says last year, so that would be 1923 for when he's telling us the story. So give Fitzgerald a break on that in case you happen to notice that. This is also one of the reasons why World War I is never referred to as World War I. It's the Great War, and both the author and the characters had never heard of World War II, so that's why it remains as such. And that's also another class distinction between Nick Carraway and someone like Tom Buchanan. Nick Carraway has served in the Great War. Someone like Tom Buchanan would never have fought in the war. So that's just another sort of subtlety in terms of characterization. Fitzgerald also employs color as a way to represent symbols, so pay attention to that in terms of how he represents wealth. I'm going to share a piece from chapter 1 where Nick is going over to the Buchanans for dinner and he walks into the room where Daisy Buchanan and her friend are sitting on the couch. We walked through a high hallway into a bright, rosy-colored space, fragilely bound into the house by French windows at either end. The windows were ajar and gleaming white against the fresh grass outside that seemed to grow a little way into the house. A breeze blew through the room and blew the curtains in at one end and out the other like pale flags, twisting them up toward the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling, and then rippled over the wine-colored rug, making a shadow on it as wind does on the sea. The only completely stationary object in the room was an enormous couch on which two young women were buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. They were both in white, and their dresses were rippling and fluttering as if they had just been blown back in after a short flight around the house. I must have stood there for a few moments, listening to the whip and snap of the curtains and the groan of the picture on the wall. Then there was a boom as Tom Buchanan shut the rear window, and the caught wind died out about the room, and the curtains and the rugs and the two young women ballooned slowly to the floor. First of all, that is Nick observing. We can take a step back. We can know as readers that we don't have to be impressed, although I think it's presented in a very impressive way, but Nick is impressed. Nick is enchanted by this particular room and these particular people and these colors, the wedding cake ceiling and the wine-colored rug. It's got its own intoxication to it, but it's an illusion. And that's where Fitzgerald is sort of laying this out, where when you're not really dealing with reality and it's really a fantasy, then it's gonna crack, and it cracks pretty quickly. It cracks in chapter 1. Pay attention to the fact that Tom is racist. He is an entitled person who is concerned about people taking what he believes is rightfully his, even though he's never worked a day in his life. He's inherited everything. Pay attention to how he treats his wife and other women, and even Nick, the way that he's carting him around the house and talking about how great his place is and complimenting himself. Notice how many times he interrupts Daisy in chapter 1. Notice that power structure between the two of them. And certainly, not that Daisy isn't without her flaws, but certainly there's a little bit of insight into the struggles that she's had being married to Tom, because they're very, very young people. And yet we know from the story that she shares with Nick in chapter 1 that he not only is cheating on her at dinner, which we saw with the telephone call that comes in, but also when she was giving birth to their child. They have a 2-year-old, and she makes an allusion to the fact that Tom was God knows where, which certainly means that he was out doing something that he shouldn't have been doing. And with everything in this particular world, I also want you to think about Daisy. I don't find her to be a particularly likable character, but I don't want to prejudice your thoughts about her. But I do want you to think about, what is it that she has? She has everything, and yet, what does she look forward to? She looks forward to the longest day of the year and then misses it. What is she doing all day? My gosh, she's not productive. She doesn't seem to have any hobbies. She doesn't seem to think that anything is worth being passionate about. And I find that to be very, very difficult to deal with. There's no sense of urgency. That's one of the things that Nick notices, that these sorts of parties were just something to do until it was time for them to be over. So that doesn't seem like the kind of life I would like to live. And I think that that's an important observation to make in terms of what Fitzgerald is really saying about what does it mean to have a lot of money. I would be remiss if I did not mention the fact that we're dealing with a rumor mill. At the very end of chapter 1, the Buchanans are saying their farewells to Nick, and then Daisy says, well, wait, we heard that you were engaged to a girl. And Nick says, no, I'm not engaged. And they say, but it must be true. We've heard it from 3 different people. Nick would know if he's engaged to someone. And so the fact that there's sort of an argument with the source, Nick, it indicates how powerful rumors are. So pay attention to that rumor mill throughout the novel as well, because that's sort of its own little character that comes in and presents itself time and time again. And finally, we have the introduction to the title character, Gatsby. So as Nick is arriving back to the West Egg where he lives, he notices Gatsby, and as he's thinking, maybe I've observed him in an intimate moment, and he looks over at whatever Gatsby's got his attention on, there's nothing there but a green light, and when he looks back, Gatsby has vanished. So we'll have to wait for another time to be introduced to him. I hope that's been helpful. I hope you enjoy this novel. I'll be back with some notes about the next couple chapters.